Welcome everyone. This is the Firefly Insights series. This particular series is around software-defined access. My name is Andrew Stinson. I'm a senior consulting engineer at Firefly. I've been working with DNA Center, SDAccess now for about 4 years, a little over 4 years. Today's series session is on fabric deployment. This is the 4th session out of 5 in this series. Overall, we've been talking about giving an introduction to SDAccess, what it is, what a fabric is, with software-defined networking concepts that we are in our software-defined access deployments. In our second session, we talked about fabric constructs and forwarding. So we covered a lot of the different objects that we're going to be talking about today on what they are. We're going to go through creating many of these objects and looking again at where these objects are created and how they all connect together. In the last session, we talked about ICE, introduction to ICE itself. We looked at the architecture of ICE and what a deployment looks like, how it integrates into DNA Center, and how we handle our authentication with our policy sets and authentication, authorization profiles, and policies, and all of that. Today, we're going to be looking at deploying the fabric. We're going to walk through some basic ideas about the fabric we're going to deploy. We're going to look at the objects in DNA Center. Some I've already created. We'll look at each of those, and then other ones we'll create, like the fabric and the various pieces of that. We're going to provision the underlay onto a switch, and we're going to use DNA Center's LAN automation tool. It may look a little different in my lab deployment than what you'll see in yours, unless you're running 235, because there's a whole other workflow for LAN automation now. But it's doing the same thing. And then we're going to provision the fabric to a switch. We're going to check the authentication, make sure our endpoints are authenticating, and we're going to validate the configuration on the switch itself. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is what we're actually going to be deploying, okay? And what we are going to deploy is a single stack. It's 9300, and we're going to deploy this in what's called a fabric in a box deployment. And what a fabric in a box deployment means is that we're going to have one network device that is going to have all of the roles for our fabric on there. So it is going to be our border node, it's going to be our edge node, and it is going to be our control plane node, all in one switch or one stack, okay? This is useful for smaller sites, remote locations, things like that. We can also add in the embedded wireless controller on here as well. So we can have one box that provides all services except for the authentication. So our switch, we are going to have one wired client connected to it. It's sitting on 209, and we do have another device connected on 2011 that it's an AP, but we'll look at how we can configure ports directly or manually for devices as well. Okay. We have a handoff to an ISR, and that's on 208. Okay. And so this is going to be our IP transit out of our fabric. So when we configure our border node configuration, we're going to pick that interface, and then we're going to put in the details for the handoff for the various virtual networks we're going to deploy. Okay. Now, so far, we already have the ICE integration completed. We'll review that in DNA Center real quick. And we have a basic switch configuration already on that 9300. I just did a plug and play onboarding, and I have an onboarding template that just configures the management interface and IP and stuff like that. So DNA Center has access to the switch, and it is in inventory. I have not provisioned the switch yet, so we'll do that in just a second here. Okay. So that's the physical design that we're going to do today in our fabric. The logical design is we have a site called DNAC branch. Okay. And that's where this switch is going to be residing. There's one building, one floor at that site. And we're doing client authentication. All the required configuration has already been pushed to the client endpoints. Yeah. Now, as far as our IP pool design, remember that IP pools, these are used for various purposes within our fabric. Our IP pools are going to identify the Anycast gateways that we're going to deploy, which are going to be the gateway for all of our endpoints that are connecting to our fabric. It's also used to define our AP IP range for all of our APs. That lives in the infra VN, and we'll talk about the VNs we're deploying in a minute. And then we have I'll go ahead and add the corp pool. This is the one that we are going to be deploying for our data for our users. I have a LAN automation pool, and that's for the LAN automation workflow. And then I've also got an infra pool. And this infra pool is used for the border node layer 3 handoff. This is something that is optional now in DNA Center. Previously, you had to have that infra pool defined, and DNA Center would pick out the IP addresses for the local interface and for the BGP peer. And then you would just let DNA Center pick it, and then you would go and look at the configuration and then configure your Fusion device with the other information. Now we have the ability to just assign those IP addresses statically, which is a nice feature they added. So we'll look at both of these options. Okay. But in our deployment, we're not going to use this, but I have it created so we can look at it. So before I get too far here, let me find my DNA Center. First thing we're going to do is do a quick check of our inventory. We'll look at our DNAC branch site. Okay, so here's the switch that we're going to be making our Fabric in a Box deployment for. I have not provisioned this device yet, so I'm going to go ahead and provision it. Provisioning is required before you do the LAN automation and before you can push the Fabric configuration to the device. So I've got it in inventory. I'm going to go ahead and provision it. I have a template configured to push out some additional configurations to the device. enabling things like netconf and stuff like that you don't necessarily need to do in 235. It will enable it for you, but we'll just go ahead and push this configuration. Nothing in that template is for specifically for our Fabric deployment. It's just DNA Center specific things I wanted to enable. Okay. All right. So while this is provisioning, we're going to review our site. So we will have had to already create our network site in our network hierarchy, and we would have already had a device in inventory and, as I said, provisioned. So refresh here. Okay. So I have the DNAC branch building created. We could create the site just by clicking here, choose to define an area. An area contains one or more areas or buildings. And then a building contains one or more floors. It doesn't have to, but you have to have floors added in order to deploy access points in the DNA Center. But the DNAC branch is a building. We do have one floor defined on that as well. Okay. And we have our network settings defined. So we have client endpoint authentication enabled. We have our ICE node, our admin node chosen, and then our PSN chosen. We have a standalone ICE deployment, so we have all services running on one node in our lab. We have some DHCP server configuration, DNS, NTP, all these other things enabled as well. Under IP address pools, here I've defined those pools we talked about. So the ones we're going to be looking at is this LAN automation pool. We have a /25 defined here. There's a couple of things to note. We'll talk about LAN automation in more detail in a little bit when we run through it. But you do generally want to have a pretty large pool for your LAN automation if you're going to be reusing this pool for multiple sites. That's because of the way it breaks up the pool. Like I said, we'll talk about that here in a little bit. We have the infra pool. It's not a terribly large pool. Again, this is used for the local interface and then the peer interface. It's going to pull out some /30s out of it and automatically assign them for us if we wanted to. We have the corporate pool. Now, I don't identify if this is for data or voice or anything like that. That's all done when we define our fabric network, when we attach these to our virtual networks. And then we have the AP infra pool. You're going to want to have a separate pool just for your access points. They have a separate, a specific virtual network they belong to, the infra virtual network, and there's a specific entry for identifying this pool for access points. Now we can have other pools in here. I could have multiple corporate pools defined in here if I wanted to have one for a certain group of users or endpoints, and if I wanted to separate that out, we could do that. In our case, we just have the one pool. Remember that our policy is not defined around our subnetting. Our policy is defined around the identity of the endpoint and the group it belongs to. So we can have one large pool. We don't have to worry about our spanning tree or our flooding issues with that within our fabric because that doesn't exist in our fabric. So we can have much larger IP pools and be comfortable about performance on our network. All right. We may not have much time to go over wireless. It's a very simple deployment for Fabric, but we would have also defined any wireless networks we wanted to define here as well. All right. So we've looked at the design, looked at the different network sites that we created. We looked at the network settings. Let's take a quick look over at our ICE integration. So over in our system and settings, we have the authentication and policy servers under authentication services. So here we have our ICE configuration integrated. We can take a look here and see the radius IP address, the shared secret that was defined, the username and password for our ICE deployment, and as well. So we've done the ICE integration at in preparation is our virtual networks in our scalable group. So for Fabric, we're going to have a really simple design for our virtual networks. We're going to have the infra VN. This is the global routing table. This is the where our access points are going to get IP addresses for management. This is where the switches, the loopback zero interfaces that we use to manage them, the ISIS and our underlay is all going to be living in the global routing table, and the infra VN is associated with that GRT. Okay. We don't have any SGTs assigned to that infra VN. Then we're going to have a prod virtual network. The prod virtual network, we're going to have a couple of SGTs assigned to it. We're going to have employees, and then we're going to have finance. And we could have, multiple SGTs assigned to this, many more if we wanted to. We could add additional virtual networks. We could add a guest virtual network, an IoT virtual network, whatever use cases we have. So we're going to take a look over at our virtual network configuration. And to do that, we go to provision and then SDAccess and then virtual networks. And we want to create the virtual networks first so that we can then go over to our scalable groups and create, assign those scalable groups to the virtual network. All right, so here's the virtual networks we have defined. We have the infra VN defined here already. This will be already in the DNAC, and then we'll have the prod virtual network here. Virtual networks are just the name. That's all they are. You just add the name and then they're created. And then that allows us to point our scalable groups and provision them to that SGT or link them to that SGT. So when we come down to policy and group-based access control, and we head over to our security groups, here we can define the security groups I talked about. So we have employees defined, and it's part of the prod virtual network. If I wanted to create another scalable security group, demo employees, then I can just go ahead and create it, and I can add the virtual networks it needs to belong to. So if I want it in prod, I can do that. Remember that all scalable groups are going to be part of the default VN automatically. You can keep it in there if you're not using the default VN in the same fabric as your user VN. that's fine. Generally, I like to remove it. I don't use the default VN normally, but I just like to make sure that I have the um, virtual networks I'm expecting that to be belong to. Okay. And we also have the finance um, scalable group already defined. You see this one. It's part of a couple different ones. Admin and prod. We're not deploying admin to our fabric, so that's fine. You want to have your scalable groups generally belonging to one virtual network. At the minimum, only one virtual network in a fabric. So we can define policy here if we want. Within our SDA environment, permit IP is going to be our default. Uh, and so any endpoints that come on board will automatically be able to talk to any of the other endpoints within the same scalable group and within the same virtual network. Uh, so for our case, that's fine. But if we wanted to, you can go ahead and define all your policies for you. We talked about this last time, and then in the second session, you just click on the demo employees to intranet in this case, the source group to the destination group, and then assign the contract you want to be applied to it. And the contract is going to have a certain number of certain rules defined in it that's going to say what's allowed or denied. But you don't have to have anything defined at the beginning when you're deploying it. All right. So that takes care of the fabric design within the fabric, and then the physical infrastructure, the roles that we're going to be assigning, and the IP pools associated with it. The next thing that we're going to look at is how we're going to deal with our handoff, how we're going to get to the fabric from outside networks, and how the fabric's going to get to other networks. And we're going to be using an IP transit today. There are two types of transits. Remember, there's the SDA transit, which allows for encapsulation of our traffic with the scalable group attached in between multiple fabric sites. So we can traverse a non-fabric network with a VXLAN encapsulated packet and be able to apply policy on the other side. IP transit is just our standard handoff, what you would see in most sites, just as your standard internet handoff. Um, and for SDA, when we configure our border node and choose our L3 handoff, it's going to deploy BGP. So we're going to have a BGP handoff here. That BGP handoff, when we define our IP transit, we're going to define the ASN for the peer device for our Fusion router. Okay. Then when we go in and define our border node, we are going to define the local ASN. In our case, we're going to define the 65100. Okay. We're going to pick an interface. In our case, it's 208 because that's the interface that's handing off to our ISR. And then we're going to pick the virtual networks that we want to hand off. And we're going to assign a VLAN. And we're going to assign the IP address for the local IP, and then the peer for the SVI. And in our case, we are going to be configuring 5 for the local, so 6 will be the remote. And then for our prod, we're going to use VLAN 3103, and we're going to assign it /30. Now remember, if we used the infra pool, then these numbers would it'll just automatically grab some /30s and assign it for us. And then we can go back in and get what the peer address is and configure our upstream device. Okay. The last question we have on our configuration is how we're going to do our authentication initially. So we could start off with no authentication, and just everything that connects would be able to get an address and go online. We are going to deploy an open authentication in our case. We could do low impact or we could do open. Low impact and open allows you to get some access like DHCP, Pixie, things like that, but you don't have full access to the network. Once you've been authenticated and the authorization comes in that tells the network device what group you belong to, then you get assigned to it and then you get full access based on the policy that's applied. So we're going to be doing the open authentication. Okay. Now those configurations are found first off here under provision, and under SDAccess we see our transits defined here. And we have one transit already defined, the MPLS ATT, and you see we have the ASN defined. So we can reuse this transit to multiple sites. And we don't have to create a unique transit for each site. So as long as all of them are configured and have the same ASN facing our fabric, then we're good. We can reuse it. If you're needing to have multiple deployments have different ASNs on them, then you would create a new transit. So you just create a transit by just choosing the type of transit, put in the name, you pick BGP, that's the only option, and then define some ASN you want that the remote device is going to have. Okay. All right. Now we've already defined the virtual networks and the groups that belong to them. And we've defined the IP transit. So now it's time to go ahead and create the fabric. So I'm just going to create, click on the Create Fabric button, and we're going to get this wizard that pops up. We're going to choose the fabric site. So this is a list of our network sites, and I'm going to choose the DNAC branch. Now by default, all of the branches, all of the areas, buildings, and such underneath that are going to be part of that fabric site. So you want to be aware of where you're building that fabric at, which root site you're picking. Okay. So we have wired endpoint data collection. We want to enable that. That's required. Here we choose our authentication type. We're going to choose open authentication. If you need to edit the configuration, like if you want to do MAB first, then you can choose it here, the timeout, things like that. On low impact, you get the option of defining your specific access contracts, your pre-auth ACLs. Hit next. Let's see, we got a question here on what switches the transit ASN. So the IP transit is applied to your border switches, whichever border node you're configuring at the time. If it's an internal border node or an external border node or any border, we'll go through that border configuration so you can see how that gets applied. But it's only applied on the border nodes. So we have the option of configuring our fabric zones, and we haven't talked a lot about fabric zones, but essentially a fabric zone allows you to have a subset of devices within your fabric that can have a unique assignment of virtual network and IP pools to them. So it gives you that ability to segment part of your fabric out from your main fabric. Before we would have had to deploy a completely separate fabric. So a fabric zone will use the parent border nodes and control plane nodes. It just allows some more granular configurations. It can have different IP pools assigned to a different subzone. We're just going to choose to set it up later and then deploy. Okay, so we have our fabric site created now. Okay. If we click on it, we're going to see the devices that are in inventory on DNA Center available to us. The next thing we want to do is head over to this host onboarding tab. This is where we can change the authentication, the global authentication for our site if we need to. This is also where we're going to start attaching our virtual networks. We want to do this, we have to do this before we define a border node because you have to configure a handoff for your border node. And if we don't have a virtual network, we can't complete that configuration. So we're going to add our virtual networks here. I'm going to add the infra VN first. And then I'm going to add our prod virtual network. Okay. So I have the two virtual networks assigned. I'm going to click on my infra VN and I'm going to add an IP pool. And I have my AP infra pool. And I'm going to tell DNA Center that this is for an access point. I'm going to give it a name, a VLAN name, and we'll see where that comes in. We talked about it in the last session, but this VLAN name is important if you're doing multiple fabric deployments, multiple different fabrics within an environment. It can save you a lot of time and headache. Okay, and then we're going to click deploy. Now, we haven't assigned any roles to any devices or anything, so there's no configuration being pushed out to those switches yet. I haven't made them fabric devices yet, so this is just doing the configuration on the back end for DNA Center so it knows what it needs to provision. And when we pick that IP pool, the gateway that we defined on our IP pool is going to be available when we define our fabric nodes as the gateways. That's the SVI gateway, Anycast gateway. So I clicked on the prod virtual network and I clicked on adding an IP address pool. And here we're going to add the corp pool branch. And we're going to call this IP pool prod. Well, let me double check that. I can make it something different and show you why it matters, but are you? Did it time out on me? I think it timed out on me. There we go. Okay, so the prod-VLAN is the name of the group. So prod-VLAN. So we're going to be referencing this VLAN name in ICE. So that's why I'm being particular about what this VLAN name is. Okay. Now, I'm not defining a VLAN ID. I don't care about the VLAN ID in the fabric. I don't have a use case requiring that. I'm not going to statically assign this to a security group. So it could be used by any of my security groups, but I do have to define if this is data or voice. And I'm going to go ahead and click on wireless pool. Some environments we deploy a separate IP pool just for wireless. That's not required in for an SDA fabric wireless. we can use the same pool for our wired and wireless environment. And this checkbox makes that IP pool available for use in the Fabric wireless configuration. So we're going to add that and deploy. Okay, so we have our basic Fabric designed. So we're going to be ready to start deploying endpoints or network devices to our Fabric. And the first thing we're going to need to do is head over to our inventory. We want to make sure that our branch site, our branch switch is reachable and managed. We want to double check our provisioning, make sure that it is has been provisioned, so we have a success for our provisioning. Okay. The next step is going to be deploying our underlay. So we've defined our site, and now we want to deploy our underlay to our switches that are going to be provision the Fabric configuration. The underlay is, we can do a manual deployment of the underlay, or we can use the LAN automation tool in DNA Center. Deployment of the underlay requires deploying some sort of control plane for our underlay, some sort of routing protocol layer 3. In our case, we're using IS because we're doing LAN automation. That's the default that's going to be pushed. If you're doing a manual deployment, you can deploy any routing protocol you prefer. It's going to configure a loopback 0 address. Again, if we're doing it ourselves, then we need to do that. It's going to configure a layer 3 link between all of the network devices attached. Okay. It's going to do some other various configurations, making sure that jumbo frames are supported, and obviously for ISIS, it's going to enable IP routing. Things like that will be configured as well. When we do our LAN automation, we have the option of having it go ahead and configure multicast on our underlay. If you're doing this manually, then you're going to want to do this. If you do LAN automation and don't deploy multicast, you'll need to go back later and then deploy it. If you're wanting to do things like layer 2 flooding, that multicast in the underlay is required because that's what's leveraged for that. Now, LAN automation is a workflow in DNA Center that will configure all these things for us. And we choose a seed device. And this is a device that's already in inventory on DNA Center. And DNA Center will access that device. It will set up a DHCP server with all the configuration required for plug and play onboarding. Okay. We will also choose interfaces on that seed device. And the interfaces are the interfaces where any of the downstream devices are connected. So we have our seed, and we may have 3 different switches attached to it. We may have other switches here attached to it that we want to deploy. And so if this is 101, 102, and 103, then we would identify ports 101, 102, and 103. It will do DHCP for those interfaces, and it will attempt to onboard devices plugged into those interfaces. These devices need to be in a factory default configuration. So there needs to be no configuration on those devices at all. So you can do a wipe on them with a PMPA service reset to clear all the config and have them boot up with a plug-and-play agent ready to be onboarded, or just pull out of the box and plug in. Now this DHCP server scope is going to be pulled from the LAN automation IP pool that we define. So part of that is going to be for the DHCP scope. And then it's also going to pull out a subnet of devices to be used for configuring the loopback 0 interfaces. And then another group of IP addresses is going to be pulled out to define /31s on all our uplinks. So all of these interfaces will be configured as layer 3. All of these devices that it onboards will get a loopback 0 address assigned to it. ISIS will be configured on all of these devices, and all the other configuration required. If multicast is chosen, then multicast will be deployed as well. Now this will go down 2 levels. So if this switch is found and onboarded, and this device is plugged into it as well, and it's in factory default, then it can be onboarded as well, but it will only go down 2 layers. So if you have additional layers of switches you need to onboard for your underlay, then you can rerun your LAN automation, say at this switch as the seed, and then it will be able to find those other devices. Okay, so it's something you can run multiple times. Now, if we choose to deploy the multicast, then the seed device, the first time we deploy this, is going to be set up as our RP. So there's no way to override that through the LAN automation. It's going to be configured as the RP for the underlay multicast. And again, that's used for layer 2 flooding if that's required. And this is a separate, completely separate from enabling multicast on the overlay for your endpoints. This is a completely separate thing. All right, so let's look at the LAN automation workflow. Now, in previous version of DNA Center, you would access the LAN automation by going to Actions and Provision, and there'd be a LAN automation option there. In this version, we have a completely separate workflow here for LAN automation under Provision. But it does the same thing. It just gives you a different flow and a view of things. So I'm going to click on Start LAN Automation, and we get this wizard pop up here. And we're going to choose the seed device. So I'm going to choose my branch site, and then we should see our switch on the drop down here. Okay. So I've selected the switch as my seed device, and I'm just going to pick an interface I know doesn't have anything connected to it, because I'm not going to look for an address new devices because I'm only deploying one switch, but I'm going to use it to deploy the underlay on that single switch for me. So I'm going to select that and then hit next. And now we choose again the branch site. We don't have to have the seed device in the site. It could be at a different site. In this case, it's all on the same site. So I'm going to choose a DNAC branch site so I can choose my LAN automation pool. Under advanced attributes, this is where we can enable multicast. Okay, so I recommend going ahead and doing this, even if you don't have a use case for layer 2 flooding right now. Just go ahead and do it. It doesn't add anything really extra to the environment, and it saves having to go back and do it later. Okay. The recommendation is generally not to configure a ISIS domain password. If you want to or need to, you can. If you did a manual deployment or LAN automation deployment with a password, then you have to put the password in here if you're running LAN automation on that fabric in that same ISIS domain again. Okay. We can put a hostname prefix if we wanted for all of the devices it finds, so that we could say that if it finds any device, then prefix branch for the name of the device. We can also have a text file that tells us that this serial number is going to have this name. Okay. We're going to review the configuration. We see the interface selected, the device, IP pool. I'm going to go ahead and start. Now we're going to see that this is initialized. This status will change until it lets us know that it has been deployed. If we take a look at our 9300, see that we have ISIS deployed now. We have our loopback 0 configured now. And we'll see a DHCP server configuration here. So we have a DHCP server, network orchestration with IP addresses from that range that we selected. Okay. This option 43, this is the command for plug and play onboarding. So if you haven't looked at plug and play onboarding on DNA Center, this would need to be configured in your DHCP server. One of the options is to configure this in DHCP server so you can plug and play onboard a device. Okay. All right, so seed is provisioned here. That's all that we're needing right now. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the LAN automation. If we were going to be seeing multiple devices, then we'll start seeing devices coming in. So you'd see them starting to pop in here for your seeds, what devices were discovered, if they've been provisioned successfully, and all of that. So you may need to run it depending on how many devices are being onboarded. It may take half an hour to an hour. So I have the seed. That was information. Up on me today. Okay, stop the session. And we see that stop is in progress. Give that a second. And once that has finished, then we'll have a underlay successfully deployed. And that allows us to now start heading over and deploying configuration for our fabric itself. Whenever it stops, it removes the configuration from the DHCP server and all of that. So it will put those IP addresses that were unused back in the pool. If we run LAN automation again and use the same device or same IP pool, then it will pull out a range for DHCP and all of that and go through that again. So it is possible to get to a point where you don't have enough IPs for the DHCP scope. Let's see. We had a question. How is the seed device is configured just like all the other management in DNA Center. It's so it's either a CLI SSH connection, which is how most of the network devices are managed in DNA Center right now. So just like if you were pushing a configuration template or provisioning a device in inventory, it logs into the device and does the configuration. If we take a look over here at our inventory, you can see that we have some requests to update devices. Let me see. Here's a LAN automation start. So we can take a look and we can see a configuration that is configured that gets pushed to it. You can come in and you can take a look at what commands get pushed and what the results are. Yes, answer the question about multicast. The multicast underlay, when we're talking about the underlay, is different from multicast overlay for your endpoints. And to make it a little more confusing, there's native multicast, and then let me show you in the Fabrics site here. We don't have to go over the full multicast discussion in this session, but if you have a specific a need for the multicast, let me know. We can hang on later or get some other call to discuss it. But don't think we can launch the multicast workflow until we provision the device fabric, but we'll take a look. So we configure multicast for our network devices through this workflow. And we have the native multicast or head-end replication. The head-end replication uses a border node to replicate the multicast traffic to unicast VXLAN encapsulated packets through the fabric. So it's easier to deploy, but it doesn't scale real well. Native multicast deploys another multicast deployment in the underlay, and it creates a our broadcast and that endpoints joined to with an underlay multicast. So it'll use a separate multicast tree for distribution of those groups. The underlay is specifically for like the layer 2 flooding. It's not to provide multicast connectivity for your endpoint. All right, so we have our LAN automation completed. So we have our underlay deployed. We've done all the pre-required configurations in DNA Center to let it know what we want our fabric to look like, who's going to be joining our fabric and everything. So we're going to start configuring our fabric. So I'm going to click on the node. This is the branch 9300 switch that we've been working with. Let's see, someone reporting they're just seeing a white screen. Is anyone else not seeing my screen? Let me pause and restart and see if it'll refresh. Look good now? Okay, great. So I'll just back up a little bit. So all I did is just click on this switch, this branch 9300 switch, and that takes us to our device details page. So I have these three different roles I can assign to this device: edge node, control plane node, and border node. The edge node has no special configuration to it. I just flip that switch and it's now an edge node. DNA Center will push the Anycast gateway to it and all the other information that's required for the edge node for endpoints to start connecting to it. When I do enable that, I get the option of doing a couple other things like enabling the embedded wireless LAN controller. So I can turn that on, and if it's running the version of code, that pop-up reminds me of something. When I'm running that version of code, then then it will allow me to go through the workflow to deploy the embedded wireless controller. If not, then I have the option of choosing the image to provision to the device. What I forgot is that after you do the LAN automation, you do need to come in and do a resync of the device, because the LAN automation enables certain features like IP routing. And on DNA Center, whenever you push a configuration to a device, you want to generally resync. If you do a configuration template, it's going to resync automatically. If it provisioned a new device, then when it gets onboarded, it'll resync. But the LAN automation doesn't resync the seed device. So because I provisioned the seed, I need to resync this so DNA Center will be able to see that change in configuration and know that IP routing is enabled and the other configurations are enabled. So we'll just wait for this minute for it to resync. And this is the same in any other configuration. If you are doing the application visibility and you needed to enable something, you want to resync before you go in and try to redeploy the application visibility. If you're trying to do the netconf and you enable the netconf on the device, then you need to resync before you try to re-enable it. So, okay, so our device has resunk. So let's head back over to our fabric. Okay, so that's the edge node. So I'm just going to go ahead and click that. Now, if I clicked add and deployed this now, that switch will be an edge node. I will not be able to come back later and make it a control plane node or a border node or turn off edge node on it. I would have to completely remove it from the fabric to re-add those roles. So you want to make sure you know what roles the devices are going to have. Re-adding devices to the fabric, if you have to remove them and re-add them, doesn't take long. Just make note of the configurations that you're going to put in. And DNA Center will push the configuration for you, but just be aware of that. The next thing I'm going to enable is the control plane node. And we're going to have two options here, the Lisp BGP or Lisp PubSub. Lisp PubSub is the go forward, it's the recommended deployment. But if you're not running iOS XE 17.6 or later, or you have existing fabrics deployed with previous versions of DNA Center before PubSub was released, or that have been deployed with Lisp BGP specifically, then you're probably going to want to stick with Lisp BGP, because if you do deploy an SD transit, then you can't mix the PubSub and BGP fabrics, and your transit is going to be deployed as either PubSub or BGP. So if it's a new fabric, do PubSub. If you have existing fabrics, you're probably going to want to stick with Lisp BGP. I just have the one device. I'm not doing SD transit, so I'm just going to stick with the Lisp BGP. And I get the error that the current combination of roles is invalid. So I can't have an edge node and a control plane node only. I can have an edge node and a border node. I can have a control plane node and a border node, but I can't have a control plane and edge node. But when I enable the border node, I get this screen now. I can choose to configure my layer 3 or layer 2 handoffs, and I'm going to do my layer 3 handoff. So this is where I'm going to assign the local ASN. This is the ASN that's going to be configured on my border node. So it's 65.100. You see that we're set to default to all virtual networks and not to import external routes. So this makes this border node the default gateway. or the default border for all traffic. And since it's my only way out, I don't need to learn the routes outside of it. I know that anything not in the fabric is going to be outside. So there's no reason to import the external routes. The advanced is if you want to, if you have multiple border nodes, then you can define specific priorities if you want one to be preferred over the others. So when we add our transit site, you see we have our MPLS ATT IP transit already defined. Here's where we can pick the infra IP pool. Again, if I pick this pool and I add my virtual networks here, I'm not going to be able to put anything for the IP addresses. I've got a big red circle. I can't define that. And DNA Center will look at that IP pool and will just automatically pull out a /30 for me. I don't want to do that in my lab. I have very specific configurations, so I'm just going to remove that. And so now I'm able to not choose one, add my configuration 208, and then when I enable my infra VN, I can put in a specific IP addresses. Okay. So for my infra VN, I'm going to go ahead and put in the VLAN. DNA Center will configure this SVI on my border node, and this is going to be the sub interface that needs to be configured on my ISR to enable the peering. All right, and I have these IP addresses assigned to this. So my peer address is 109.6 and my local address is 109.5. And then I'm going to enable my prod virtual network. Now, one thing to note is that these are at the virtual network level. These are not at the IP pool level. So if I had 5 different IP pools for prod, all 5 of those IP pools are going to be distributed to my upstream device through this link. And I can have multiple layer 3 handoffs defined. So I may have a separate one, completely separate border node for my guest virtual network, or have a completely different interface for guest. Okay, so I've defined 5 local, 6 remote for my infra VN, and 9 local, 10 remote for my prod VN. I save that. And you see that interface gets created here, and I'm going to add. That warning has been removed because I'm perfectly able to have border node, control plane, and edge node all in one for my fabric in a box deployment. I'm going to click add, and then I'm going to click on deploy. I can choose to deploy it now, schedule it for a later time, or generate a configuration. If I wanted to look at all the configuration it's going to push before it gets pushed, I can do that as well. We'll go ahead and do that so we can take a look. And when DNA Center does that, it all shows up over here in activities and then work items. So here's that configuration. I can click here and I can look at the configuration that DNA Center is going to push to enable all 3 nodes for the device. So we have our policy maps for our IBNS2 configurations. We have the various templates, interface templates defined. We have the VRFs defined for a prod network. We have our VLANs defined for the IP pools. All the configuration and everything that makes the fabric work on that switch. I can review this and then I can click on deploy. I still have the option to deploy it later if I need to, but I'm going to go ahead and deploy it now. Delete that work item. If we want to check on status, we can come over here to tasks and see that our provision devices. We'll just wait for it to be deployed. Let's see, it'll probably finish before I can get over here. But what we're going to see is that we now have this device colored blue. We see the 3 roles assigned to it: border node, control plane node, and edge node. Okay. Just check again real quick because I think it's probably still. Oh, yeah, finished. Finished just as we went over there. So we can see that it took just a little under a minute to deploy all that configuration. Okay, so now we have our fabric deployed. We're going to have a new option available to us when we look at our fabric. If I go to host onboarding, I'm going to see this new tab here, port assignment. What this lets me do is come in and statically configure one of my interfaces for a specific virtual network, a specific or a specific IP pool, or a specific virtual SGT, or for a specific type of port. So we're just going to do a sort here by link status and show you that. Say on this port here, come in and say that, well, this is going to be an access point, and it's going to automatically give it the AP pool VLAN. I could say that this is a user device, and I can say that I want this to be part of my prod VLAN, and it's going to be forced to the employee security group. If I don't put a security group at all in here, then they'll still authenticate, but they're going to be assigned in that VLAN. The policy will still apply. Now remember that VLAN is tied to a virtual network. So you're not just defining the IP pool and the gateway that that user is going to have, but you're also placing them in a virtual network when you choose that VLAN. And then we can choose what type of authentication template we want if we don't choose the security group. So we can have different levels of authentication if we need to for specific devices. Okay. So useful for devices that a lot of times we see this for APs. You may want to manually provision your APs. Some devices that don't support .1x and you don't want to do MAB, you'll need to go in and manually configure them if you want those ports to be authenticated. Or you just choose, just not to do authentication, and you just tell it you're going to be in this group. Okay. All right, so we've done that configuration. Let's hop over to our ICE deployment here and take a look at what we have. So I have a policy set defined here, my demo policy set. We see we're looking for, it's the first one in the list. So it's looking for any devices coming in with a wired MAB or wired 802.1x authentication, okay? Any request that comes in that matches one of these 2 conditions is going to trigger this policy set, and we're going to flow into it. In this policy set, I have an 802.1x rule, which is for our 802.1x wired authentication, and we're referencing our DNA Lab Active Directory instance. Then I have a MAB authentication policy for devices that want to do wired MAB, doesn't support .1x. And we're looking at internal endpoints. So these are endpoints in ICE that have been profiled, that have been manually configured within ICE. this is what it's going to be looking at. So we're trying to authenticate the user or device with .1x first. If we fail that, then we're going to come over to MAB if it doesn't have .1x, and then we're going to try to check them against the internal endpoints. If it's not doing either one of these, then it's going to hit default and it's just going to reject, but these two will catch all our stuff. Okay. If any authentication fails, if the user's not found, it's going to be rejected. If it can't communicate with the AD server, it's going to drop the request. Same thing with our MAB. Okay. So once a device gets past our authentication policy, it's going to hit down to our authorization policy. So ICE knows who you are. It knows that you are valid, you have the right credentials. Now it's going to determine what to do with your endpoint, what policies are going to be applied. And I have two different authorization policies defined here. I have finance and then I have MAB workstations. So in finance, I'm looking for devices that are authenticating with 802.1x and is part of the domain computers. And so if I know that you're a domain computer and you're .1x, then I'm going to give you the Fabric Finance result. If you are, if you don't match those conditions, you're going to come down to the next line, and we're going to see if your device has been profiled or not. If it's been profiled, then I know you've been on the network. In this case, I'm trusting it, and I'm just going to give you the Fabric employees list, okay? So the difference is that this one is checking my Active Directory external groups, DNA Lab, that's our Active Directory forest. And we're going to be looking at the domain computers and authenticating it. Otherwise, it's a device we know should be on our network, and we're just going to give you employees. If you don't match either of these things, you're just going to be denied access. Okay. I'm going to save that. I just fixed the typo on there. Now, if we want to see what's going on our device, we are on our authentication, we can come over to ICE and go to Operations and Live Logs. And so here we can see any authentications that have occurred. We're going to ignore these because those are just checks. So we're going to head over to our live sessions here. And we see that we have a workstation here that was authenticated. We see that it has been assigned the finance security group. It did .1x authentication. We see that it's also profiled, so we know it's a Windows 10 workstation. We see that it used PEEP with MS Chat v2. And we see that we used our demo policy set, authentication 802.1x, and then we went to our authorization profile, our policy, and we applied the finance authorization policy. And that finance authorization policy applied the Fabric Finance authorization profile. This is where we're defining the scalable group it belongs to, whether to allow access or not, what VLAN pool it belongs to, all those types of things. We see the IP address of the network device that it's connected to, the switch. We see the ports they're connected to, various other details, okay? Now, if I head to my policy, it's yeah. Okay, so we're going to check our authorization profiles here. And so we have Fabric employees first. And we can come down here and we can see that we have a security group checked. We see that we are assigning the employees security group. We see that we are choosing the prod virtual network. We see that we're assigning a data type for this authentication, and we're choosing the VLAN. Okay. This is that prod VLAN. Now I have that prod VLAN deployed in two fabrics. I have it deployed in my headquarters and I have it deployed in my branch. Because I use the same VLAN name in both, then I can have just one authorization profile that references that same name. And I can authenticate those users at multiple sites, and I don't have to create multiple authorization profiles because I'm using the same pool name. Okay, that's why the pool name is important. We'll check over real quick over to our finance. And in our finance, we see that we're assigning the finance security group. Still prod, still data, and still in the prod VLAN. Okay. Now, what does that look like on our switch? So let's take a look here. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to look at is the environment data, CTS environment data. This is letting me know that the switch is connected through CTS successfully, and that I know that environment. Okay, this isn't saying that these are connected to this switch right now. This is just saying that these are the SGTs that awareness of. So we're linking the tag ID with the actual name. I'd give it another, there we go. Take a look at my SGT map. I can see that I have one host on 111.101 with SGT4. And if we look up here, we see SGT4 as employees. And I have another host, 111.102, with SGT18. And we come down here, then 18 is finance. And that coincides with what I'm seeing here in ICE, where I see one in finance and one in employees. Okay. Now notice here that this is an access point that's authenticating as employees, since I don't have a separate rule set up to check for my access points, but it is a profile device. So that device is going to employees because it is an internal endpoint. All right. The next thing I can do is take a look at what my permissions looks like. So remember that 4 is my employees and 18 is my finance. So if I take a look at the role-based permissions, this is basically the ACLs, we can see that employees to employees, we're denying ping. BYOD to employees has this new contract defined. Finance to employees has a deny ping. And employees to finance has a deny all IP. And BYOD to finance has this new contract assigned. Okay. So this is how we can take a look at if perhaps two users that are in the same virtual network are having issues, or even in the same scalable group, are having issues connecting, we can take a look and see if if there is some role assigned on the switch directly, though usually it's easier through DNA Center. But sometimes a policy will get defined and it doesn't get pushed, or it's in a queue to get pushed, and you may be expecting a deny ping, but you can check at the switch and make sure that it's received it has the most recent roles and permissions defined on it. Okay. The next thing we can look at on here is the device tracking database. This is that IPDT that page that popped up early on that was forced. You had to enable it. This is what that IP device tracking database is. So it is a combination of the IP address of the device. You see a DHCP for 102 and 101. The MAC address, we see the interfaces, we see the VLANs that are assigned to them as well. So this gives us all that information in one table. So I know that this device, this one right here, this 101, is an access point. So if I take a look here, that is connected to 2011. So let's go in and configure that port for an access point. So I'm going to head over to my branch fabric site, come over to our host onboarding, and do port assignment. I'm going to change the order to link status so it's easier to find the ones that are connected. And here's 2011. So I'm going to click on it, choose access point. There's no authentication template on there. I know it's an access point. I don't have any question on that. And we're going to update. Now we're going to need to go down here and do a deploy. Again, we can choose now, later, or look at the configuration preview. If we take a look here again at our you see that we're missing one of those entries because it's not in our prod verf anymore. Yeah, the InfraVN is part of the group. So if we take a look at our interface here, we see that VLAN 1021 has been assigned to that 2011 interface. We see that VLAN 1021 is one that was configured in DNA Center, and it is part of the AP pool IPv4 instance. Okay. And if we look over here on ICE, we should see that session terminated because it's not authenticating on ICE anymore. So this has been removed. So that's how we can manually configure an interface, force it into a specific group. We can do that with users as well. So let's say we decide that we want this to be in the employees group instead. Well, if we want our devices to now be under employees, we can just head over to our policy, come over to our authorization policy, and then we can change our profile to Fabric employees. Okay. So now that we've changed that to Fabric employees, I can now come over to our session here, and I can have it do a reauthentication. And that's going to request the device to reauthenticate. and we should see this security group clear. And we should see it come back in as employees. Get over here quick. Do a force with a bounce here. And what we should see is it come back in. If it dropped, we should see it come back in here in the live logs. So while we wait for that computer to come back in, let me see. Yeah, I hadn't refreshed yet. So while we wait for that, and if it doesn't work, I may force it to reboot or to resync. The next thing I wanted to touch on real quickly, we have a little bit of time left, is on the wireless. So on our wireless SSDs, we're not going to have any ability to do any configuration here. Because one, I don't have a wireless controller provisioned yet, and we don't have a profile defined that is telling DNA Center what wireless SSIDs to allow. So let's see if we can enable our wireless LAN controller as our wireless controller for our fabric. All I did was just click on the controller and choose to enable the fabric. You see this little circle here? This is letting us know that there is a change being pushed. Okay, so we got a success. So now we have a wireless controller defined for our fabric. But we still don't see any wireless networks available. And that's because what we need to do is come down to our design and go to our network profiles. And on our network profiles, we can see that we have branch wireless profile here. And we're going to take a look at what that profile says. So the branch profile has two wireless SSIDs defined on it, DNA Lab, OTT, HQ. And you notice that this is, let's see what sites. Yep, this is our branch site. You see that this is not set to a fabric wireless, it's set to no. Same thing with this other one. So the designation of a wireless network to be fabric wireless or non-fabric wireless is done in the network profile. So if I wanted to change, say this DNA Lab OTTHQ to fabric for this site, I can click yes and then save. And now I would reprovision my wireless. And if you're not sure how DNA Center wireless management and all of that works, keep an eye open for our DNA series where we talk about wireless and how it's managed and all that in DNA Center. But I've got my 9800 here. I'm going to provision it. You see that I have my SSIDs defined here. I have my guest, and then here's my OTT defined. So we've got our configuration done or running. Let's take a look. Did we get a failure here? Let's see where our failure happened. Okay, I think we may be okay for that. Let's take a look. Okay, so now when I head over to our wireless SSIDs, I now see that I have the DNA Lab OTT-HQ SSID available. And so now I can come in and I can say, okay, I want to assign it that prod VLAN IP pool that we assigned before. I can put specific security group on that SSID as well if I want to, but I can go ahead and deploy. And then that will provision that SSID to my Fabric site. And so the Fabric that this wireless controller is managing will any APs that are onboarded through here that are managed by it are going to then offer that SSID as a Fabric wireless network. Right. So that is still not disconnected. So let's see if I can hop over to my other jump host, see if I can hop in there and I need to reboot the client. Let's see. Usually it goes through very quickly, so it's probably just Windows. While I'm doing this, are there any questions on what we've covered so far? Okay, good. Okay, yeah, it came right back up here, and you see that it got the employees security group. All right. Okay, so on this session, we covered a lot of things. But what we did is we deployed a full fabric, a very simple one, fabric in a box, but this has all roles defined in it. So we have our border node, controlling node. We looked at the IP pools. It made sure that the network site was created. We did the uh, network device could integrate set. We hand off to our external router, our Fusion device. We see the VLANs that we defined, the IP addresses we defined, and then the handoff, the external ASN and the internal ASN. We define the control plane node, in this case list BGP instead of list pub/sub, and then the edge node. We added a fabric wireless controller. We deployed the virtual networks and IP pools to our fabric. We deployed a wireless SSID to our fabric, and we did a static assignment of a port to a specific VLAN pool within our fabric as well. All right. So if there are no other questions, that's the end of the demonstration on this series or this session. The next session is our last session. Let me double check that we are doing it next week. Oftentimes we will skip a week when there's a holiday. So give me just a second and I'll double check that. And apologies, I should have checked on that before. But the next session, we're going to be talking about deployment or migration strategies, some of the best practices, things like that when you're doing a deployment, some of the things you may run into as well. So yes, we do have our next session on September 7th at the same time. All right. So if there are no other questions, I appreciate everyone's time. Hope you all have a great day. Thanks a lot.